So it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Greater Good Gathering 2.0. I'd just like, before we start our panel this morning, I want to thank a couple of people for making this possible. First of all, Eric Schnurr, who really is the originator of the whole idea of the Greater Good Gathering. And we are delighted to be co-sponsors here at Columbia SIPA. We've had a lot of help with this conference from the Academy of Political Science, Bob Shapiro playing two roles. Normally he just plays Woody Allen, but in this context he's doing the president of the Academy of Political Science and a professor at SIPA. The Columbia Law School is also a sponsor. Public Works, Brainstorm Consulting, and the Union Theological Seminary. And we want to thank them all for contributing to this really exciting conference. I also want to thank some of the people who work so hard behind the scenes to make this happen. Kevin and Ashley, who work with us at SIPA, without whom this really wouldn't have happened at all. Lauren, Caroline, and Lacey, who work at the Academy and with Public Works, all of whom really did an extraordinary effort to put these events together. Some of you who have done these kinds of things before know how difficult it is, especially at Columbia University. And I think they've done an extraordinary job. Thank you all. So it's my pleasure to be moderating our first panel of the morning. And I'm Esther Fuchs. I'm a professor here at SIPA and the Department of Political Science. The title of our panel is Consciousness, Technology's Effects on Thought and Thinking. Not exactly a small topic, but as you will see, we've got the right panel to have this discussion. Now, just briefly, we all recognize the pervasiveness of technology in our personal relations, at our jobs, and in our political life. And whether it's family dinners where everyone immediately takes out their smartphones and puts them on the table, and it makes you wonder, do they think that little black thing is more interesting than I am? And at work, when we find ourselves buried in email or start thinking about whether the new technology will actually someday replace us completely, or in political life, as yesterday's panel explained, algorithms are being used to micro-target voters during elections. Judges are using them to decide bail or prison for offenders who are awaiting trial. And of course, in my own field, smart cities are going to solve every urban problem from mass transit to poverty. And of course, I've yet to understand what a smart city really is because, you know, none of us really want to live in stupid cities, do we? So, but most of us actually don't really understand how technology works, especially how it impacts our cognition and thinking. And when you start thinking about it, just you yourself, as a simple human being, actually start thinking about it. How can we really understand whether technology is ruining the quality of our life, or it actually will produce a future for us all that we're looking forward to, if we don't understand how it affects us in the most fundamental ways? So today, it's fortunate for everyone here that our panel this morning can help us answer some of these critical questions. So I'm going to take a seat and we'll begin our discussion. So we will begin today, and I'm really delighted to be doing this introduction with the perfect person, Jeannette Wing. Jeannette, I'm on, yes. Yes, you wanted everyone to hear that introduction. I think that's right. Jeannette is the Evanescence Director of the Data Science Institute here at Columbia University and a professor of computer science. Before she came here, she was the corporate vice president for Microsoft Research and, of course, has had a distinguished academic career. And we're very fortunate that she came to lead our Data Science Institute. So, as a computer scientist and a data scientist, you've seen the evolution and explosion of the field of artificial intelligence. So I'm going to ask you the simple question of the day. Can you explain to us how AI actually, what it does that may actually impact our human cognition, and why maybe we should be worrying about this?
Thank you, Esther. I am delighted to be here, and I wanted to... Okay. Can you hear me now? Great, wonderful. So I wanted to address this question of evolution and explosion of artificial intelligence and answer the question, what can humans do that computers cannot? What can computers do that humans cannot? And what can they do together that outdo either alone? And I think this will address some of the concerns and the capabilities of artificial intelligence as we know it. But before I answer those questions, I wanted to take a little time to give you a little history of how artificial intelligence has come about, and especially the recent few years of why AI has exploded in terms of its prevalence and its applicability to everything. So I'm not going to go back to the dark ages, if you will. I'm just going to go back to 1956, which is when there was a Dartmouth conference, a conference at Dartmouth, and basically who we call the grandfathers of AI convened. And that was where the term artificial intelligence was first coined by John McCarthy. In fact, the proposal that he and others wrote for holding this summer research institute was to study every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence that can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. In other words, the goal was to build a machine that could essentially simulate intelligence, let's just say human intelligence. But early on, even at this conference, everyone realized that this was too big a problem to solve all at once. So what happened in the field is very early on, the field divided the tasks that humans are good at, like vision and speech and language and mobility and so on and so forth, into separate buckets, and then the scientific community tackled each of these tasks to the point where each of these subtasks that humans are very good at became their own subfields of computer science. So you had computer vision, and computer speech, and natural language processing, and machine translation, and they all became their own complete little communities for decades, until around the late 90s, early 2000s, when a technique called machine learning really came to fore. And the reason that machine learning came to fore then is not because it was a new technique, it's because the compute power was sufficient to actually make those algorithms efficient and practical. And so what happened was you saw the computer vision community using machine learning to do better computer vision. You saw the computer speech recognition community using machine learning to do better speech recognition. You saw the machine translation people using machine learning to do better machine translation. You saw the robotics community using machine learning to do better robotics. And then everyone thought, wow, maybe we can take this common method called machine learning and address the original vision in 1956 of the grandfathers of AI, and maybe we could actually build a machine that puts it all together. And that is caused a huge resurgence of interest in AI. People then, lots of press writing about general AI and all that kind of stuff, which we're very far from being able to do. And that excited the community, but then I think the major breakthrough recently was around 2011 when the technique called neural networks showed how, for the first time, not just with large compute and these algorithms that had been around for a while, but lots and lots of data could actually do tasks that were as good and eventually better than humans. And so now, technology that, for instance, recognizes faces is as good or better than humans. And the computer program that plays Go is better than humans. And so everyone is scared, oh my God, AI is going to better us in terms of what we can do. So on the one hand, there are certain tasks that are very well defined when the rules of the game are understood and no one breaks those rules and everyone plays by those rules. It's like a game. And yes, you can make this computer program do better than a human. On the other hand, there are still a lot of things that computers are not good at, no matter how much AI you throw at it, because the learning is not there yet. So the canonical example is common sense reasoning. Little kids know how to do common sense reasoning. We don't know how to get a machine to do common sense reasoning. So all of us who are rational and have some common sense, our thought processes are not going to be easily taken over by AI yet. The other thing that we are very good at that is very hard to get machines to do is fine motor manipulation. So picking up this cup and knowing just how much pressure to put, first of all, what grip to use and how much pressure to put on this paper cup versus this plastic bottle, which is heavier. Easy for us. Even little kids can do that. Very difficult to get those robots to do that. We're making progress, and a lot of the progress is made due to feeding lots and lots of data to these algorithms so that the robots can learn over time something that looks like that might have water in it, might weigh so much, it's a plastic, it's not paper. Oh, lots of reasoning going on there. Very quickly can figure out the grasp and not crush the bottle or the paper cup, and use a sufficient grip to actually pick it up. So, but it's something so easy for us, and we still can't do that so easily. So there are some, now, okay, so that gives you an idea of where the capability is today of what machines can do over humans and what humans are still better at. How about when you put the two together? And this is what's very exciting in the computer science and artificial intelligence and data science community. Because when you put the intelligence of machines together with the intelligence of humans, then can we actually do better than either alone? And there's one example that is probably, it's already an old example where this goes to show, and I'm going to give you a more concrete example after this one, but the one example that really impressed the community is, believe it or not, playing chess. And there's a competition in the chess world, and you have to really be a chess fanatic to know this particular competition, where computers and machines together form a team, and they play against other teams of computers and humans. And they show that, and that, of course, these teams also have played against just machines and just humans, and they showed that this combination of humans and machines actually, for this particular competition, the rules are all set, outperform humans alone and machines alone. but you'll really like to know, you really like the answer of, well, what was the secret? And the secret is that in the competition, it's timed, and so you have to make your moves by a certain time. And it turns out that the human's intuition was critical for saying, I don't want to wait for the machine to spit out the answer, we're just going to make this move. Which is a little, it's nice for us humans to know that there's something to human intuition. From a scientist's point of view, it's a puzzle. We don't understand. That's one example. A more concrete example is with big data, a lot of the deep learning algorithms and models are best when they're fed with data that is labeled. And today, who does that labeling? Usually it's still people. Humans are, a Mechanical Turk, crowdsourcing or whatnot. So there's still a lot of human input to making those deep learning models effective in the end. That will change over time. We will automate a lot of this, but right now there's still an important, boring task that humans play in making machine learning models of today effective. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jeannette. See, my build-up was really right on the mark. I think I just learned more in this brief presentation that you made about cognition and computer science than I did from reading several academic articles, which I personally did not really understand. So this is an extraordinary way to start, and then we're going to go into some applications and thinking about this. And our next panelist is Adrian Ward. Adrian is an assistant professor of marketing. That made me nervous when I read that right away, because of course marketing we don't associate with everything positive about how we...
It makes me nervous too.
Oh, good. Okay. He's at the University of Texas at Austin, and he studies technology, cognition, and how we can be better to those around us, which I thought was a very interesting description of your research. So most people don't realize that they have relationships with their smartphone. We know we have smartphones, but this idea of having relationships with technology is something we don't really think about much. We think about relationships with other human beings. And what I learned from looking at your work briefly is that this can affect our knowledge, our beliefs, and even the decisions we make about other people, this idea of relationships with this technology. And this is fascinating research, it really is. And so what I thought would be interesting for us this morning, and it really links to how Jeannette kicked us off here, is if you could explain how these relationships develop, and something simple like, how does it impact us in our day-to-day life in ways, of course, that most of us really don't think about?
I'll try. So I'm a professor of marketing, but I'm a trained research psychologist. I'm a social cognitive psychologist, so I do experiments to try to figure out how technology is affecting us. And a lot of my work is about memory and attention, but in this sort of social context. So I want to start by not talking about that, but by talking about animal behavior. I used to want to be a zoologist, so this is like my dream. But a metaphor that I think is really helpful for thinking about this sort of thing is that of a supernormal stimulus, which is something that did not exist in the environment when an organism was evolving, but now does exist and sort of surpasses anything that was available at that time. So my favorite example of this is of gulls. So gulls have eggs, and they've got to incubate those eggs by sitting on them. And the way they sort of decide which egg to sit on, which one to preferentially pay attention to, is they just pick the biggest egg, which is a pretty good rule because the bigger eggs tend to be more viable. However, if a scientist shows up and paints a football white and puts it next to the gull is going to sit on the football and ignore all of its own eggs, right? This makes sense because there's a biological limit on how big of an egg a gull can produce. So they just need to know bigger is better. They don't need to know what the best thing is or what the right thing is. But the selection pressure can sort of be manipulated when somebody comes in and says, all right, I'm going to give you something bigger than what could ever exist in your world. And gulls don't know how to deal with that because they never had to deal with that as they were sort of evolving this rule of bigger is better. So luckily, there aren't a lot of sort of trickster scientists running around painting footballs white and putting them, yeah, right? But we're a lot like gulls, right? We have the same sort of easy solutions to complex problems. And those solutions evolved in a context where we didn't have a lot of these technologies, right? And so this isn't just about computers or smartphones. People have made the same argument about sugary and fatty foods. The reason that we are very attracted to sugary and fatty foods is they used to be pretty rare in the environment and they're calorie dense, and so if you could get them, you should get as much as you possibly could. But now we can just create those foods and we have an obesity epidemic, right? So if we're thinking about this in the context of computers and technologies and smartphones, one of the things that they're really good at and that we're really bad at has to do with just how much information that they can hold. So one of the most fundamental constraints we have as humans is that we have limited cognitive capacity, we have limited cognitive resources, we can't pay attention to everything in the world, we can't notice everything, and we can't know everything. So starting first with this idea that we can't know everything, lots of times it would be good to know stuff. We've never been able to know everything, but we've figured out ways to solve these problems. And a very easy way to do that is to store that information externally, whether it's in a book or a notepad, or one source we use a lot is other people. So I don't need to know how to fix a car if my mom's a car expert and I have her phone number, right? And so we've developed what are called these transactive memory networks, where we know who knows things, and that's pretty much just as good as knowing it. But it's only as good as knowing it if they're going to give you that information, right? And so there are natural constraints on that network as well. And also, if you don't know anything, eventually people are going to kind of kick you out of that memory system because you're a free rider. And so there are things that force us to know things as well, right? And so if we think about who we should sort of allow to know things for us on our behalf, well, you want somebody who has access to that information or knows that information, and somebody that's going to give that information to you. And so we sort of distribute information among our social networks. Now, introduce computers and the internet into this same transactive memory system, and it turns out that they surpass any human on these same dimensions, right? They know more than anybody else. It's instantly accessible. They're not going to get mad at you, right? They're not going to go on vacation. You can always get this information, and they don't ask you, like you don't Google something and they're like, all right, but real quick, you tell me something, right? You just get that information. And so more and more what we see is that people will offload the responsibility for information and memory onto the internet, not just at the expense of other people, but at the expense of their own memories, right? And so we no longer have this decision of, well, should I know this myself? Because we have this sense that everything is saved. So I've done research showing this in learning situations where online classes, if you tell people this is on YouTube, they just don't remember it as well, even if you tell them you're going to take the video down, because we have this sense that we can find it if it's online. Nothing ever actually disappears, right? Versus something live, people will actually remember it a little bit better. Even with factual information, we do this financial decision-making information. Once you know that it's being saved, specifically by a computer, you don't remember it, even if we pay you to remember as much as possible. And that's because there's this very basic human constraint that we have, which is we have limited cognitive resources. And so we're trying to do the best that we can with our limited resources in a very demanding world. So that's how we can think of people are worried that we're not remembering things. That's a well-founded worry. The other slice of this that I think is also really interesting is that there's a difference in retrieving information from a computer or a smartphone than from a person. So if I have to go find the right person, I've got to track them down. Maybe they don't know the information. It's a very physical thing. And I might learn something, but I know that I'm not the expert, right? I might become an expert over time, but I can still know that that information came from them. In a lot of my research, we find that when people Google information, they think that they remembered it themselves, and they think that they thought of it themselves. Yes. Yeah, right. And so a lot of this is because the internet's faster than our own internal search processes. If you're asking Google a question, you're kind of asking it to yourself. Before you can realize you don't have that answer, Google gives you the answer, and you say, oh, okay, I actually always knew that. Right? Even beyond that, it's a seamless interface. And so I don't know if anybody remembers Lycos, but for a while, Lycos and Google had almost identical search results, but nobody used Lycos. So I did an experiment where I had people either use sort of a physical card catalog, use Lycos, or use Google. And then I just asked them a bunch of questions, and afterwards, I didn't ask whether or not they thought they knew it already, I asked, did you answer this yourself or did you use an external source? And people who use Google didn't even remember using Google, using an external source at all. When they used Lycos, when they used the external sort of card catalog, they remembered looking it up because that process of looking it up reinforced that this was an external information source. So more and more, we're offloading information to the internet, but thinking that we actually know it ourselves. And so we can think about this at a cognitive level. We can also think about it as a social level. It's not very romantic, but one of the reasons we need people is because they hold information for us, and they allow us to know things, and they allow us to navigate the world. But if we don't need people for those reasons, that's one less reason to have social connection, right? If I have time, one more thing. Okay, cool. Another really fundamental constraint we have is not just on knowledge, but on attention, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in this room right now, but you're not noticing all of it. Hopefully you're noticing what's happening right here. But attention is selective. You can pay attention to some things and not others. And so a common problem we have is we go into a new environment, we have to figure out what's important. How do we direct our limited attention? And it uses some cognitive resources to do that sort of attention selection process. So one way we can solve this is instead of every time we go into a room having to figure out, yes, no, should I pay attention to this? Yes, no, should I pay attention to this? Things that always tend to be relevant, we automatically attend to, right? So things like the sound of your own name. There's this thing called the cocktail party effect. If you're in a room, there are a lot of conversations happening. You filter out the things that are not relevant to you pretty automatically. But if somebody on the other side of the room says your name, it pops through that clutter. Right? And so at a very basic cognitive level, you're not intentionally looking out for it. It's finding you because that's relevant information. Similarly, research shows that new mothers, if a baby is crying, they hear that. Research on new fathers is more mixed. But that's something that's important that you should pay attention to. You shouldn't have to decide whether or not you need to pay attention to that. What we're seeing is more and more as we put basically everything important and rewarding and satisfying into one device, which is our smartphones, which you carry around with us everywhere, we automatically pay attention to our phones. And there's even neuroscience research showing that the sound of your ringtone activates the same area in your brain as the sound of your own voice. The sound of your own name, right? So not somebody else's ringtone, but your ringtone, that's the same area as the sound of your name. This is a very self-relevant thing. So we did some research, and we wanted to look at how just having your own smartphone around would affect the amount of cognitive resources you have available for other tasks. So this isn't multitasking. By the way, multitasking is a myth. It's not good for you. Don't do it. This is just having it around in the presence and not using it for the task. And what we found is that the closer people's phones were to them, if they were on the desk in front of them versus in their pocket versus in another room, the less available cognitive capacity they had for other tasks. And that's because your brain is saying, pay attention to this thing. This is your email, and this is cat videos, this is social media, this is your calendar, this is everything. And so overriding that automatic urge, which makes sense, right, in this context of how we're trying to navigate a complicated environment, overriding that urge uses up some of your cognitive resources, leaving less available for the task at hand. So even when you're doing a really good job at not being distracted, you have to realize that you're doing a job to not be distracted. And by carrying around these sort of distracting items with us everywhere we go, we're constantly putting ourselves in this space of attentional tension where we have to override this automatic urge. So a lot of the stuff I do is thinking about how technology is interacting with our own sort of limits and how we're, in some ways producing unexpected outcomes, but from the same sort of cognitive tendencies, cognitive systems that we've been using all along. Yeah, all sitting on white footballs. There you go.
Thank you, Chris. There's so many questions I could now ask both you and Jeannette, but we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to wait till all of our panelists get a chance to speak. And so I want to introduce our next panelist, Chris Bale. Chris is a professor of sociology and public policy and the director of the Polarization Lab at Duke University, where he helped create Duke's interdisciplinary data science program. And so much of what you do is close to things I think about. So I initially tried to ask Chris a really hard question that nobody really has answered yet, and fortunately for him, I sent it to him first. So I've changed it up to be more reasonable, but I might come back to that really hard question. So that's just a little fair warning. So many people who are concerned about social media echo chambers, and we heard a little bit about that last night in the panel moderated by Jim Fallows. Politics has a big problem when it comes to echo chambers, or the tendency for people to create social media networks that only expose them to views or opinions that they already agree with. So this is not just an issue in politics, it's an issue in every aspect of our life. So I know your research is around this area, and I'm hoping that this morning you can explain to us how these echo chambers shape people's political attitudes and their ability to empathize with those who have opposing views, which I think is just a critically important question for us in the United States, in local communities, and of course globally. So go for it.
Thank you. I might begin with something that Jeannette touched on, which is that humans and machines working together have come to improve the way we can classify things. I would argue that's one of the positive developments in AI. The negative developments have to do with in kind of embedding human bias in algorithms. So, sometimes this is called human-in-the-loop dynamics. If we ourselves have some kind of bias in categorizing something, then a machine will reproduce that. And we see this all over the place, from decisions about parole, which increasingly are being made by algorithms, all the way up to how we build our social media networks, which, as Esther mentioned, is my area of research. So it's been well documented now that people tend to follow people on social media sites like Facebook or Twitter who already share their views. This has the effect, as Esther mentioned, of us becoming kind of repeatedly exposed to information that already conforms with our pre-existing views. So the upshot of this, and something that's implicit in a lot of what policymakers, academics, and all sorts of public intellectuals say, is if that we could somehow break our social media echo chambers, if we could step outside them and listen to the other side, that there would be more moderation. We would be able to empathize with each other. We would be able to understand each other more effectively. On the other hand, if you spend any time on Twitter, you'll know that it's not exactly the paragon of the civil sphere that, let's say Rousseau might have been imagining, right? To put it lightly. So there's this other stream of research which has documented so-called backfire effects. So when I'm exposed to something that conflicts with my view, I'm reminded of all the reasons I don't like that view. And in the end, I'm left with more reasons to disagree with that counter-attitudinal message than I might have had I not seen it in the first place, right? So the challenge for many years for social scientists like me has been to try to figure out how to do research on this issue. We can do it in the lab, and there's plenty of good work that can be done in the lab, but lab research has its limits. On the other hand, this brilliant new field that's being called computational social science has identified a way of embedding experiments within social media platforms themselves. Now, some of these are more controversial than others. Everybody here probably knows about Cambridge Analytica and the so-called emotional contagion experiments on Facebook. But when done ethically and with careful human consent, there's a real opportunity to see what happens in the real world, in our case, when we disrupt social media echo chambers. So in the polarization lab that I lead at Duke, we recruited about 1,600 Democrats and Republicans who use Twitter regularly, and we paid half of them to follow bots that our team built that retweeted messages from opinion leaders from the other side. So if you're a Republican, for 1 month, you saw 24 messages a day from Democrats, elected officials, journalists, media organizations, advocacy groups, and vice versa for Republicans. They were exposed to Democrats. And during this time, our bot each day, someone mentioned cute cats, I think it was Adrian, retweeted cute cat pictures. And then at the end of each week, we asked people whether they could identify the cute cat picture. So we not only effectively kind of disrupted people's social media echo chambers, but had some sense of who's paying attention, who was able to recognize the cute animal pictures. So what did we find? So going in, we had hoped, as a polarization lab, that we might decrease polarization. We saw in no case a decrease in political polarization. Instead, we saw Democrats become slightly more liberal after following Republican bot for a month, and Republicans becoming substantially more conservative after following a Democratic bot for 1 month, on the order of the change in public opinion over the last 10 years, just through 1 month of exposure. So what does this mean? Well, getting back to the kind of practical upshots of this and how we're interfacing with technology, the Washington Post recently reported that Twitter has been experimenting with exposing its users to opposing views. And Facebook has done this as well. I mean, it's a very logical, solution to try to counteract the tendency of people to kind of reinforce their view, right? So our research suggests that's not going to be a panacea. We're not going to be able to simply shift the algorithm and move the needle. Over time. Have we re-interviewed them? So the question is, did we re-interview them a year later? Well, it hasn't been a year yet, so but now you're giving me a great next project. Right, exactly, yeah, always, yeah. So yeah, we haven't looked at the persistence of it. So some people, when I describe the study, they say, well, you confirmed what I already knew. Twitter is bad for democracy, Facebook is bad for democracy, right? And I don't necessarily disagree in some respects, but I also think it's naive for us to say, well, let's all get off social media. Or at least for some, us older folks, maybe that's reasonable, but anybody under 30, right, as Adrian has so, eloquently just documented, is going to give up their phone, right? So what can we do? We have to tweak and probably not replace. What types of things might work? Well, we're currently pursuing 2 follow-up studies, one which exposes people to moderates from the other side instead of the whole range of views. It could be that there's a curvilinear effect, so if I'm a strong Republican and I'm exposed to a strong Democrat, that has a backfire effect, but if I'm exposed to a moderate Democrat, maybe that has a moderating effect. Second, we can work to correct misperceptions about the other side. So if you ask Democrats, who are Republicans? The answer you typically get is Republicans are older evangelical Christians who are wealthy. And if you ask Republicans who are Democrats, most Republicans will tell you Democrats are younger, minority, and very progressive. Turns out, of course, that the average Democrat is a middle-aged Christian from the Midwest. The average Republican is a middle-aged Christian from the Midwest, right? So some research shows that just simply correcting these misperceptions can, that's going to change, exactly, yeah, exactly. And then lastly, if I could just sneak in one more thing, and this gets back to something that Adrian was hinting on earlier, some of the really interesting work on correcting these backfire effects suggests that if you can make someone think that the opinion was their own, then they're more likely to embrace it. So in an interesting recent study, some scholars told someone, exposed someone to some misinformation, and then asked them about it. And the people who agreed with it, they then 1 week later told them that they had actually disagreed with the misinformation. And if people are led to believe that they themselves judged the information as true or false, then they're much more likely to endorse that kind of rejection. So there's something about being force-fed information, and that's really the environment we inhabit on social media. It's just a constant fire hose of information, right? But if we can give some kind of autonomy to social media users, and so I've been working with Twitter to develop tools to do this, where we can allow people to monitor their exposure to the other side, allow them to monitor when there's disagreement about something they're seeing, and make their own choice about whether to change their mind.
Thank you very much. I have so many questions and I'm holding off. The research is really fascinating, and but we who are social scientists do know that we're not always that great in disseminating or even interpreting the kinds of research that we do, and I would include scientists in that group as well. So we're actually extremely fortunate today to have with us Judith Shulevitz, who is a New York Times contributing op-ed writer who covers feminism, culture, and science among the small issues we're all dealing with today. She formerly worked at Slate in its early years, which is when I got to meet her, and I really have followed her work ever since. And it's always exciting, interesting, sometimes exasperating, but always smart. What can I say? And my favorite book that she wrote, which you might think on the surface has nothing to do with this conversation, but it actually has a lot to do with this conversation, is called The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time. So I have a kind of complex question for you, Judith, which I'm sure you're not surprised that I need to ask you, because you're someone who thinks and writes about some of the really most important transformations that we're experiencing in the 21st century. And you understand the upheavals that technology has created in a lot of different spheres. And some of the research that you've done involves effective computing, which for some of us here who didn't exactly know what that was, she explains it as a way of undertaking to program artificial emotional intelligence into machines. And you know, you've written on smart appliances that we look at, you know, we're anthropomorphizing. I mean, it's kind of an extraordinary thing. And I love how you talk about that. Things like empathetic refrigerators. And without stealing your thunder, could you please explain to us what the hell this really means for us personally, in our social relations, and if you want to jump into the politics, please go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Esther. This is on, right? I want to just note something that just happened on this panel and then move into my cultural critic mode by taking as my object of research, you know, the Super Bowl. One of the themes that both Jeannette and Adrian were talking about is, of course, human obsolescence. It was fascinating to me how very slender the hooks that Jeannette hung sort of human pertinence on, fine motor skills and common sense reasoning. You know, you're really sort of pulling it back here. And you were talking about the obsolescence of the human as a form of expertise, right? As other people as a form of expertise. So what I noticed, how many people here watch the Super Bowl? I don't know if there's a big Super Bowl crowd. Okay, bigger than I expected. I personally don't understand football. My family does, so we always watch it, and their conversation goes over my head. I watch the ads. And there was a common theme in the ads. I don't know if you all noticed this, but the common theme is tremendous anxiety about robots taking our jobs, right? But not just taking our jobs. There were several that were about robots taking our jobs, but because I have my smartphone here and I can't help but hold on to it. There were two that really struck me. One was an ad for Michelob beer, and it started with people who were jogging, and then a robot came along and jogged faster than they did. Same with bicycling, same with golfing. But then everybody, all the humans, headed down to the bar, and the robot went to the bar too, but stood outside the window looking in. And the tagline was, "But it can't enjoy hanging out with the gang at a bar with a Michelob, so don't worry, drink up." And then the second one that struck me was for TurboTax, and it featured a sort of uncanny-looking robot child, like a machine, a very robot-y thing with a human face, who said to his creator or father that he wanted to grow up to be an accountant like his dad. And a woman who was there, who wasn't his mother but was being shown this cool, neat new device, said sort of patronizingly, "All TurboTax Live CPAs are human beings with real emotions. I'm sorry, but you're never going to be emotionally complex enough for that job." And the robot child says, "Is that true, Papa?" And the father says, "Yeah." And the robot child says, "I am sad." And the woman said, "See what I mean?" And the father said, "He's still perfecting emotions." So what is effective computing? Effective computing is perfecting emotions for the robot child. And I just have a funny story to tell about effective computing that I can't help telling. It was invented in the late 90s by an MIT engineer named Rosalind Pickard, who at the time was one of the few female engineers at MIT. She became interested in the question of how machines make decisions. And she began reading Antonio Damasio and other sort of psychologists of emotion and sort of soaking in the, at that point, sort of consensus that emotions are intricately and intimately linked to the decision-making process. And so she decided she would try to program emotions into machine learning and machine decision-making, computer decision-making. But being a woman, she didn't want to call it emotional computing because, women and emotions, and MIT, that was going to hurt her. So she called it affective computing, which means nobody understands what it means. So what is affective computing? It is not actually in its infancy, though we think it is. There is a part of it that is really well developed and has commercial applications and is coming soon to a high-end car near you. And that is the part of it that involves detecting emotions, right? You're all familiar with facial recognition. You're possibly somewhat less familiar with the analysis of vocal intonation to detect, to identify people. Now, all these things can also be, and body language, of course, all these things can be used to extract from this information a conclusion about, an individual's emotional state. And this is really sophisticated, and they're really good at it, and it's already being used in a lot of domains. So the commercial application that's a good example is cars. Coming soon to a high-end car near you are cameras and recorders that can sort of observe you and hear you and decide whether or not you're tired or distracted or overwrought and recommend to you that you pull off the road and calm down, pull off the road and get a cup of coffee, and so on and so forth. The next iteration is going to be what are called semi-autonomous or semi-self-driving cars. A great concern in the automobile industry is what's called the handoff. How do they decide? How does the car decide when it's okay to yield the wheel to a human? When does the car decide they'd better take the wheel back from the human? That they will be using this emotion detection technology. And there are lots and lots of applications. As you can imagine, Google and Amazon and and Apple are all trying to imbue their digital assistants with this kind of analytical ability, mostly focused on the voice. So that's the emotion detection side. And the other side is emotion synthesis, right? So, using this information to program computers to robots or computers or personal assistants to simulate or reproduce appropriate emotions, usually in response to what the emotions they detect. That is in its really early, as they say out in Silicon Valley, it's early days for that technology, but it's advancing rapidly. There's a lot of work being done on that at the MIT Media Lab. Google has something called an empathy lab. So this is, this to me is, kind of interesting in the sense that, soon Alexa will be able to figure out what mood you're in, will be able to respond appropriately, and will be able to solidify bonds between you and your device. As we know, we see the football, we sit on it. We see the device, we hear the device, it says something, even vaguely approximate to an emotion or a statement, an emotionally appropriate statement that a human would make, and we respond to it, we over-respond to it. I mean, there's a lot of information about people who confess their emotions to their Alexa, even though Alexa will then say, oh, you'd like to watch a video of blah, 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 completely misinterpreting it. But people say, I'm lonely, I'm depressed, I want to commit suicide. There's a lot of that. Alexa, will you marry me? And this is for a device that is just really deeply stupid. Right. And once they start to become less stupid, that's going to happen more and more. So they'll solidify bonds. They'll be able to solidify the human-computer bond, and that will give them a great deal of power of persuasion over and influence over our behavior. And it's not just your Alexa or your Google Home, or Google Assistant. It's in the Internet of Things. You know, your smart refrigerator, your smart toilet. I mean, these are things that are going to be talking to you and are going to be programmed to detect your emotions and one day be able to respond appropriately. Now, what does this mean for human obsolescence? I was fascinated to discover that at an effective computing conference held only a few weeks ago, there was a session called Upskilling the Human Workforce Through Effective Computing. And what they were talking about is the argument being made was manufacturing is such a small sector now of our economy, and service is such a growing sector of our economy. What we can use effectively sophisticated robots and computers to do is train humans to be better at their service jobs, to train their emotions, to overcome their sort of empathetic, their inability to be empathetic or place themselves in the minds of their customers. And never mentioned in this discussion was the fact that if robots and computers are good enough to train humans, I don't know what the humans are there for. Why bother? You know, why not just? So there's already, you know, for example, there's already therapy being done with these devices, mostly where they're avatars for humans. They're being controlled behind, as they say, behind the curtain. But you know, soon you will be having therapy with a robot, and possibly a screen robot, an artificially intelligent entity on a screen. But I think it does go back to the point of human obsolescence. The Super Bowl ads wanted to tell you, you know, we have emotions, they don't worry. And I'm here to tell you, worry.
Thank you so much. I want to go one more round with everybody and give them a chance to really comment on each other's presentations, and then we'll open it up briefly for questions. Since we started a little late, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and end a little after 9. But the set of presentations today are, you know, I wanted to say they're heartening, but mostly they're not. I was hoping for a little more optimism here about the relationships that are being developed between technology and humans and the future it might present for us. And I'm wondering if everybody can take a shot at the question of, can we turn this clock back in any way? I have 2 parts to the question. If you want to really answer that, should we be thinking about turning this clock back in some way? And if you think we can't, clearly there is a role somewhere in this morass for humans. I mean, even the example of the courts that you gave, which I'm familiar with, somebody's programming, right, and deciding what the algorithm is. So if we dig deep back enough into the process, at least with AI, as far as I understand it, there is a human component to that. And, you know, to what extent are we not talking about that and not recognizing that and not bringing that directly into our values discussion about what we want to see our society and our polity to look like, you know, in this, you know, 21st century technological world that we're creating. So why don't I start in the middle, and I'll start with Chris, and then we'll work our way around again, and we'll end with Jeannette.
Sure. I think the answer to the question really hinges on how much bad are we willing to accept alongside the good. So in the case of parole decisions, for example, there's wonderful work by the computer scientist John Kleinberg and the economist Sendhil Mullainathan, which shows that when we use algorithms to make parole decisions, we actually let people who are going to do well outside of jail out earlier. Everybody gets out earlier. The problem comes in when we look at the differential racial outcomes, right? So we're actually reducing the number of African American men who are incarcerated, but we're doing that at a rate that's slower than their Caucasian counterparts, right? So you know, this is one of these utilitarian puzzles that I think is going to come. A computer can optimize for that, but as long as, you know, race is part of that calculation, that's always going to be a problem. Another example, equally vexing, is healthcare. So if we look at the delivery of healthcare, you know, if we use machine learning to optimize decision making, like, or say testing for cancers, some of the latest research shows that we can actually make huge gains for lower income people, but those come at the expense of upper income people who will be monitored less than they are right now, right? So these types of trade-offs, I think, are in our future, and the question is going to be, you know, are the people who stand to gain willing to give up their privilege?
But also, are we going to pretend to delegate those decisions to computers and not take responsibility as a society for the values that are being, you know, represented in these decisions? And that's not a question. That's just a comment. So I'm going to let Adrian. It is a question, I know. I'm sorry, but I'm going to let Adrian continue because I'm just in the light of time.
Oh my gosh. So
Yeah.
I really think that when I think too hard about this, it comes down to what is the point of being alive and being a human, right? So if we are, you know, disposed to offload all of these tasks that we kind of have to do to navigate the world that we don't have to do anymore, the research shows that we're not going to do it, right? So you could ask, well, what's the point of knowing anything? Is there a point? I don't know. What is the point of having control over your attention? The reason we pay attention to things is because at some level they're rewarding, although people talk a lot about dopamine and say it's a reward thing. It's really motivation. But if you think of the business model of the major tech companies, it's all about capturing your attention because that is how they prove their value. Some are not financially valuable yet, and that's how they prove that they one day could be, because they can sell you ads, right? So is that really what we want to do with our most limited resource, which is attention and is time? And so you can say, is that valuable? But then you get to the question of what is valuable. And you could make an argument that if people are perfectly happy to look at screens for the rest of their lives and they're not dying and they're not hurting anybody else, then maybe that's fine. I don't know that I want to make that argument, right? But I think it really does come to the question of what is the point of our time and our attention? And do we want to have control over it, and how do we want to spend it? Was that uplifting?
No, that
Okay.
didn't help me at all. But I'm a values person, so I would mix it up with you a little bit. But I'm going to move it to Judith and let her mix it up with you.
So I have sort of two answers to your question. One is I want to talk a little bit about the good that effective computing, or at least emotion detection, can do in the world. And then I want to talk about my theory of how we can bring values into it. So something I didn't talk about is, I just wrote an essay for The Atlantic on voice and how voice affects us. And I said, the robot revolution is here. It's just happening in voices. They're not, the embodied robots are a decade away or so, but we're surrounded by voices, and voices affect us differently. Anyway, so one of the things I learned in the course of this research is that there are amazing medical applications to voice analysis through, voice analysis. There's a guy named Yuval Moore in Israel who has perfected techniques of analyzing voice to detect incipient Parkinson's, incipient cardiovascular disease, diabetes. I don't understand how this works because I am not, in fact, a computer scientist, but it's starting to have applications. Another one is in the doctor's visit. There's a company that's focusing on applications for doctors and hospitals. There is a program that exists in the cloud that can analyze the interaction between doctor and patient, recognize some emotional content and possibly dangers of things like over-anxiety, hyper-anxiety, and depression, and sort of signal the doctor during the course of the visit that maybe some questions should be asked about depression or something like that. So that's a little invasive and creepy, but it is. Also, Roz Picard at MIT is doing all kinds of work on using this kind of facial and voice analysis to help autistic people respond in a socially appropriate way and expand the circle of the social circles in which they can move and function. So, you know, I don't want to make it all to be glum. Of course, all of this does raise the specter of, you know, the obsolescence of medical professionals, but that's a whole other thing. But how do we bring values back into this equation? And, you know, you're a political scientist, and I have just one